When Daniel Hart got the letter from the county office, he didn't think much of it. He was used to paperwork, bills, and legal forms. Being a single father meant every envelope usually carried something that needed payment or fixing. He had learned to expect problems, not surprises. But this one felt different. It had an old wax seal, his uncle's name printed faintly in the corner, and the word inheritance written across the top. Daniel hadn't heard from his uncle in years. The man had lived far away in the countryside, building strange machines and writing letters that no one understood. He was one of those people who lived for ideas rather than company. When Daniel was a boy, his uncle once said, "Wind can move hearts if you know how to catch it." Back then, Daniel had just laughed. Now, all these years later, the letter said that his uncle had passed away and left behind a piece of property, an old stone windmill standing near the edge of an abandoned valley. It was listed simply as Windmill number 14. Daniel didn't know whether to feel grateful or burdened. What would he even do with a windmill? Sell it, tear it down? But when his 14-year-old son Ethan saw the letter, his face lit up. "A real windmill, Dad? Like in the storybooks? Can we go see it?" Daniel smiled weakly. Ethan had that same spark his late mother once had, curiosity mixed with stubborn courage. He couldn't say no, so the next morning, they packed a few things into their old pickup truck and drove out to see the strange inheritance. The road stretched far beyond the town, twisting through wheat fields and old fences that seemed to whisper with the wind. The further they went, the quieter the world became. The hum of traffic disappeared, replaced by the sound of creaking trees and the soft whoosh of air moving through tall grass. After almost 2 hours, Daniel spotted it. The windmill stood tall on a small hill, its wooden blades turning slowly against the pale sky. It looked ancient, with cracks running down the stone tower, moss growing along its base, and wildflowers waving in the breeze. But even in its worn state, there was something alive about it, something proud. They stopped near the gate. An old man stood waiting, holding a bunch of heavy keys. He wore a coat too big for his frame and had a weathered face. "You must be Mr. Hart," he said with a nod. "Name's Willis. I was your uncle's caretaker. Been looking after the place since he got sick." Daniel shook his hand. "I didn't even know he had a windmill." Willis chuckled softly. "Few did. Your uncle was a private man. Built things most folks couldn't understand. Machines that ran on wind and willpower, he used to say." He handed over the keys. "It's yours now. Been empty for a while." He paused for a moment before adding quietly, "At least that's what we thought." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man shrugged, looking up at the turning blades. "Sometimes at night we hear things. Footsteps, a light coming from the gears up there. Maybe just the wind playing tricks, but, well, folks say this place has a soul." Daniel didn't believe in stories. He thanked the caretaker, who tipped his hat and walked away down the dirt road. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, wood, and old oil. The floor creaked under every step. Shafts of sunlight cut through the narrow windows, lighting up floating particles like tiny stars. The main room held large metal gears, wooden beams and chains that ran up through the ceiling. Everything looked frozen in time, like a clock that had stopped ticking years ago. Ethan was amazed. "Dad, this is incredible. It's like a machine from a movie." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, and it's ours, at least until we figure out what to do with it." They spent hours exploring each level. There were narrow stairs circling up the inner wall, small rooms built into the stone, and even an old workbench covered in rusted tools. Daniel could almost imagine his uncle here, tinkering late into the night while the wind howled outside. By sunset, the windmill began to sing, a soft groaning sound as the blades turned faster, pushing air through the hollow walls. It was haunting, but strangely comforting too. Ethan suggested staying a bit longer. "Just to see how it looks at night," he said eagerly. Daniel agreed. He wanted to check the foundation before leaving anyway. He found an old lantern, lit it, and climbed up the spiral stairs while Ethan explored the higher level. Moments later, he heard his son's voice echo from above. "Dad, you need to see this." Daniel set the lantern down and hurried up the stairs. The gears above were still turning slowly, their iron teeth glinting in the light. Ethan stood near a wooden panel, his flashlight pointing into a small opening. "Look," Ethan whispered. "There's light inside." Daniel peered through. Behind the gears was a narrow space, giant like a hidden room. The faint glow came from a candle or maybe a small lamp. His heart began to pound. He pushed the panel aside and stepped closer. What he saw made him stop breathing. There was a small bed neatly made, books stacked on the floor, and clothes folded on a chair. A pot of tea sat half full beside a cracked window. Someone was living there inside the gears of the windmill. He turned quickly, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Ethan, go downstairs." But before Ethan could move, a soft sound came from the shadows and the quiet shuffle of footsteps. Daniel lifted the lantern. A woman stepped forward. Her face was pale from lack of sunlight, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her clothes were simple, worn and covered with dust from the gears. For a second, Daniel's mind refused to understand what he was seeing. The light flickered, catching the edges of her face, and then everything inside him froze. It was Claire, his ex-wife, the same woman who had walked out on him 8 years ago, leaving behind a broken marriage and a confused young boy. The woman he had thought was gone forever. Ethan gasped. "Mom?" Claire's eyes widened in shock. She stepped back against the wall, her hand trembling. You weren't supposed to find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the turning gears. Daniel couldn't speak. The lantern shook in his hand. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady creak of metal turning above them, like the windmill itself was holding its breath. He wanted to ask 100 questions at once. How? Why when... But his voice failed him. Ethan stood between them, frozen in disbelief. Finally, Daniel managed to say softly, "Claire, what are you doing here?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Please don't tell anyone," she said. "I wasn't trying to steal. I just needed a place to stay." Daniel lowered the lantern slightly. The light danced across her face. She looked thinner, older, and tired, but her eyes were still the same. Ethan took a small step forward. "Mom, you've been living here?" She nodded slowly. "I found this place a few months ago. I didn't know it belonged to your uncle. I thought it was empty. I just needed somewhere safe." Daniel didn't know what to feel, anger, sadness, or pity. The woman he had once loved was standing inside a broken windmill, living among gears and dust. The years apart had turned her into a stranger, and yet seeing her again stirred memories he had tried to bury. The wind outside began to rise, spinning the sails faster. The gears creaked louder, filling the air with rhythm. Daniel realized the whole structure was alive again, just like the past that had suddenly come back to life in front of him. He looked at Claire, then at Ethan, who stood silently near the window, his flashlight still glowing in his trembling hand. The night deepened. The lantern flickered. And for the first time in years, the three of them were under the same roof again, surrounded by turning gears and the sound of wind whispering through the cracks of the old stone tower. The world outside was quiet, but inside the windmill, time itself seemed to have started turning once more. And Daniel knew, deep down, that his inheritance was not just a forgotten windmill, it was a doorway to a past he never expected to face again. Daniel stood frozen near the gears, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. Claire's shadow flickered on the stone walls, her figure outlined by the soft golden light. For years he had imagined what he would say if he ever saw her again. He had played out arguments in his head, filled with anger and questions. But now that she was standing there, trembling and tired, those words seemed meaningless. Ethan stood quietly behind him, unsure what to do. His young face showed confusion more than anything. He had been only 6 when his mother left. Most of his memories of her were faded, like old photographs that had lost their color. Seeing her now felt like meeting a ghost from another life. Claire took a step forward, her voice soft and unsteady. "Please don't be angry. I didn't mean to hide from you. I just didn't know where else to go." Daniel lowered the lantern slowly and let out a long breath. "You've been living here? Inside this windmill?" She nodded. "It's quiet here. No one bothers me. I fix what I can, clean the gears, make tea, and listen to the wind. I know it sounds strange, but this place feels alive. It's the only place that hasn't pushed me away." Her words struck something deep in Daniel. He remembered how she used to love small, forgotten places, old gardens, broken barns, lonely corners of the town. She always said that forgotten things had hearts too. Still, the truth was painful. He looked around at the small space she had made her home. The books stacked neatly, the kettle, the folded blanket. It wasn't much, but it was proof of how far she had fallen. "Why didn't you call me?" he finally asked. You knew where I was. You knew about Ethan? Claire looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I didn't think you'd want to hear from me. After everything that happened. After I left? Her voice broke slightly. I thought I was doing what was best for you both. Ethan's voice came out quietly, trembling. Best for us? You left us, Mom. I used to wait by the window every night thinking you'd come back. Claire covered her face, tears running down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I was sick back then, lost. I thought if I stayed, I'd only make things worse. Daniel wanted to be angry, but the truth was he remembered those years clearly. The arguments, the late nights, the weight of silence in the house. Claire had always been kind and gentle, but after losing her job and her parents, she had changed. She would sit for hours staring out the window, saying nothing. Eventually, she had walked away, leaving him to raise their son alone. Now, looking at her fragile face under the flickering lantern, he saw that same sadness still living inside her. He said softly, You should have come home. Claire lifted her eyes, and for a moment he saw a small spark of hope. Is there still a home for me? No one spoke. The gears above them turned slowly, making a soft hum. The wind outside was rising, brushing through the cracks in the stone walls, filling the room with a sound like whispering voices. Daniel finally said, We can talk in the morning. Stay here tonight. It's late. He set the lantern down and Ethan followed him down the stairs quietly. They set up their sleeping bags in the lower room. But neither of them slept much that night. Daniel kept hearing the creak of the gears above and the faint sound of Claire moving softly through the upper floor. At dawn, the windmill came alive again. The early light painted the stone walls gold. Ethan was already awake, staring up at the turning blades through the window. Daniel brewed coffee in an old pot he found, and for the first time in years, the smell reminded him of mornings long gone. Mornings when Claire would hum softly while the coffee brewed, when their little boy would chase sunlight on the floor. When Claire came down, she looked shy, unsure if she should speak. Her hair was tied back neatly and she had washed the dust off her face. She held 2 mugs in her hands. I made tea, she said softly. Ethan took one without a word. Daniel accepted the other and nodded his thanks. The silence between them wasn't bitter anymore, just heavy with memories. As the morning grew brighter, Claire told them what had happened after she left. She had tried to start over in another town, working in a small workshop that repaired machinery. Your uncle's old blueprints were famous in a few circles, she said. I learned a lot from them. I liked fixing things. It gave me peace, but when the workshop closed, she had nowhere else to go. She found the windmill by accident and realized it was the same one from the old family letters. She moved in quietly, fixing small parts, bringing the gears back to life. It felt like a place waiting for me, she said with a faint smile, like it was whispering to keep trying. Ethan finally spoke. You fixed this place? She nodded. A little. Your uncle left behind good designs. It just needed care. I didn't have much, but I used the parts I found nearby. Daniel looked up toward the ceiling where the gears moved smoothly, shining in the sunlight. For the first time, he noticed how balanced everything looked. The quiet rhythm, the soft sound of air passing through. She had indeed brought it back to life. They spent the day cleaning and exploring the place together. Ethan climbed to the top, where he could see miles of golden fields waving in the wind. Daniel fixed broken steps while Claire repaired the old weather vane. They didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that spoke of healing. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the 3 of them sat outside, watching the blades turn against the orange sky. Ethan said softly, It sounds like music. Claire smiled. Your uncle said the wind was a voice. Maybe he was right. Daniel watched her for a moment, then said quietly, Maybe we can make this place our project. We could fix it together and for real this time. She looked at him, surprised. You'd let me stay? He nodded. It's big enough for all of us. Besides, the windmill runs better with more hands. A small tear slid down her cheek, but it was a happy one this time. She whispered, Thank you. Over the next few weeks, the windmill changed. Daniel replaced broken wood, Ethan painted the walls, and Claire worked on the gears. The place began to glow again, standing tall and proud on the hill. Travelers passing by stopped to watch it turn, some saying it reminded them of the old days. One evening, a local reporter came and asked to write a short piece about the restored Hart Windmill. Daniel smiled and agreed. But for him, it wasn't about fame or property. It was about family finding its rhythm again. Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread baking. Claire had started cooking again, her laughter returning slowly. Ethan often worked beside her, handing her tools or asking questions about how the gears worked. Daniel would watch from the doorway, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. One windy afternoon, Claire found Daniel standing on the balcony, looking out across the valley. She joined him, her hair brushing lightly against his shoulder. "I didn't think life would ever give me another chance," she said. He looked at her, then at the turning sails of the windmill. "Sometimes second chances come disguised as old machines," he said with a small smile. "You just have to know how to make them turn again." The sails creaked gently, the sound steady and strong. That night, the windmill glowed softly under the moonlight. Ethan slept soundly in the small bedroom upstairs. Daniel sat by the window, listening to the wind hum through the gears. He thought about how strange life could be, how something broken could bring people back together. The old windmill had once stood alone for years, turning slowly against the lonely sky. But now its heart was full again. Inside its stone walls, laughter returned, warmth filled the air, and three souls, once scattered, found their way home again. And when the wind blew hard across the valley, the windmill answered, turning proudly, whispering through its gears like it was telling the world a secret, that even after years of silence, love can still find a way to move again.